The boardroom wasn't cold because of the air conditioning. It was cold because J.R. Ewing had just walked in, and everyone in that room knew what was coming. The silence that followed his entrance wasn't respectful.
I see a winner in you, son. Hit like and subscribe, and let's stay on the winning side together. You've got the spark.
It was anticipatory, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Cliff Barnes sat at the far end of the conference table, his briefcase open, his notes spread out like armor. He'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, 3 weeks gathering evidence, building his case, rehearsing his arguments in front of the mirror. He'd told himself this time would be different. This time he had JR cornered. The oil lease dispute was ironclad. The paperwork was flawless. The legal precedent was unassailable. Cliff had everything he needed to finally put J.R. Ewing in his place. J.R. took his seat at the head of the table. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He placed his Stetson on the polished mahogany surface with the care of a man who knew that every gesture, every pause, every micro-expression was a weapon. His suit was immaculate. His cufflinks caught the light. When he finally looked up at Cliff, his smile was thin and sharp as a razor blade. "Well now," J.R. said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "I see you've been busy, Cliff. That's a mighty impressive pile of papers you've got there." Cliff straightened in his chair. This was his moment. He'd waited years for it. "It's all here, J.R. Every contract, every clause, every legal precedent that proves Ewing Oil has no claim to the Barker lease. I've got you this time, and you know it." The other lawyers shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Outside, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dallas sprawled under a merciless Texas sun, indifferent to the small dramas of ambitious men. J.R. leaned back in his chair. He didn't even glance at the documents Cliff had so carefully prepared. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a sterling silver lighter. He turned it over in his fingers, watching the way it reflected the fluorescent lights. "You know what I love about you, Cliff?" he said finally. "Your persistence. It's almost admirable, like a dog that keeps scratching at a door even after the house has burned down." "This isn't a joke, J.R." Cliff's voice had an edge to it now, a tremor of frustration that he couldn't quite suppress. "I have the law on my side." "The law?" J.R. repeated the words, as if tasting them, finding them bitter. "Yes, you've always had a peculiar relationship with the law, haven't you? You wave it around like it's some kind of magic wand, as if having the right paperwork ever mattered more than having the right leverage. Leverage won't help you here. The documents are clear. The Barker lease reverts to the state, unless the original claim holder can prove continuous mineral extraction dating back to 1947. Ewing Oil can't prove that. I've checked every record. You don't have it." J.R. smiled. It was the kind of smile a cat might give a mouse that had just realized the hole it was running toward had been sealed shut. "You checked every record," he said softly. "Every single one." Something in his tone made Cliff hesitate. Just for a second. Just long enough for doubt to creep in like smoke under a door. "I did," Cliff said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Including the ones in Judge Pryor's private files?" J.R. asked. "The ones from when he was still a county clerk? Back in '46? Before he became a judge? Before he developed that unfortunate weakness for expensive bourbon and even more expensive company?" The room seemed to contract. One of the lawyers, Henderson, from the firm Cliff had hired, cleared his throat. "Mr. Barnes, perhaps we should—" "Shut up, Henderson." Cliff's eyes never left J.R.'s face. "What are you talking about?" J.R. stood up. He walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked out at the city he'd spent his entire life learning to control. "I'm talking about the fact that you did your homework, Cliff. I'll give you that. You're thorough. You're diligent. You probably stayed up late at night going through files, cross-referencing dates, building your case brick by brick. And that's exactly why you'll never beat me." "I don't understand." "I know you don't." Jar turned back to face him. "That's the problem. You think this is about being right, about having the facts on your side, about justice." He said the last word like it was a punchline to a joke only he understood. But it's not. It never was. This is about understanding that the game isn't played on paper. It's played in back rooms and over drinks and in the quiet conversations nobody writes down. Cliff felt something cold settling in his stomach. You fabricated evidence. I didn't have to. You're... stood behind his chair, his hands resting on its back, looking down at Cliff with something that might have been pity if it had been coming from anyone else. Judge Pryor really was a county clerk in '46, and he really does have files that never made it into the official record. Files that show continuous extraction on the Barker property going back exactly as far as I need them to. Now, are those files authentic? That's a fascinating question, but here's a more interesting one. Are you prepared to accuse a sitting judge of falsifying historical documents? Because that's what you'd have to do to challenge them. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that has weight and texture, that presses down on a room like a physical thing. Henderson was staring at his notes. The other lawyers were carefully studying the grain of the table. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. You can't do this, Cliff said, but there was no strength in it. He sounded like a man arguing with gravity. I already have. JR picked up his hat. He held it in both hands, examining the band, the crown, the brim, as if it were the most interesting thing in the room. You see, Cliff, you came in here thinking you were playing chess, making your moves, thinking 3 steps ahead, setting up your checkmate. That's your problem right there. I'm not playing chess. I own the board. I made the rules, and I decide when the game is over. He placed the hat on his head, adjusting it with the precision of long practice. Now, I'm going to walk out of this room. You're going to gather up all those impressive documents of yours. And then you're going to go back to whatever hole you crawled out of and think real hard about whether you want to keep coming at me with paperwork and legal precedents, or whether you might want to consider finding a different hobby, maybe something safer. Stamp collecting, perhaps, or bird watching. JR started toward the door. He'd almost reached it when Cliff spoke again. I'll find another way. There's always another way. JR stopped. He didn't turn around. For a long moment, he stood with his hand on the doorknob, his back to the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. No, Cliff, there isn't. That's what you've never understood. That's what you'll spend the rest of your life never understanding. There is no other way. There's just my way. And every time you forget that, every time you convince yourself you've found an angle I didn't see, I'm going to be there to remind you. Not because I hate you, not even because you're a threat, but because teaching you this lesson over and over again has become one of my favorite pastimes. He opened the door. Have a good day, gentlemen. Cliff, I'll see you at the next one of these little meetings. I'm looking forward to it already. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. Cliff sat in the sudden silence, surrounded by his useless documents, his carefully constructed arguments, his righteous certainty that truth and law should matter. Around him, the lawyers were already packing up their briefcases, avoiding his eyes, thinking about how they would bill this disaster and whether they wanted to be associated with another Cliff Barnes failure. Henderson finally broke the silence. Mr. Barnes, I think we should discuss strategy going forward. Strategy, Cliff repeated. The word tasted like ashes. Yes, if Judge Pryor's files are legitimate, or even if they're not, but challenging them would mean accusing him of fraud, then we need to consider alternative approaches. Perhaps we could look into... Get out. Henderson blinked. I said, get out. All of you. They left. Of course they left. They were lawyers. They knew when a client had stopped being an opportunity and started being a liability. The door closed for the second time, and Cliff was alone with his failure. He looked down at the documents spread across the table. 3 weeks of work, 3 weeks of hope, all of it meaningless because J.R. Ewing had made a phone call or had lunch with the right person, or had known exactly which strings to pull before Cliff had even started pulling out filing cabinets. The worst part wasn't losing. Cliff had lost to JR before. The worst part was the way JR had smiled at him, not with triumph, not with anger, but with something close to affection. Like a teacher watching a slow student finally grasp a lesson they'd been trying to teach for years. JR didn't need to destroy him. That would have been easier in its way, cleaner. Instead, JR kept him around, kept letting him try, kept giving him just enough rope to hang himself with, over and over again. Because for JR, Cliff Barnes wasn't an enemy. He was entertainment. Outside, the Texas sun beat down on Dallas, indifferent and eternal. Inside, Cliff Barnes sat in an empty boardroom and wondered, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, why he kept doing this to himself, why he kept believing that this time would be different, why he kept thinking that preparation and law and righteousness could possibly matter against a man who understood that power wasn't about being right. It was about making everyone else believe you were. 3 blocks away, in his office at Ewing Oil, JR was already on the phone. Bobby?
Yeah, it's done.
Cliff showed up with his legal briefs and his moral outrage, and I sent him home with his tail between his legs. All right. He hung up and swiveled his chair to face the window. From this height, Dallas looked orderly, manageable, like a game board spread out for his amusement. Somewhere down there, Cliff Barnes was probably still sitting in that conference room, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, trying to understand why having the law on his side hadn't been enough. The answer was simple. It had always been simple. The law was a tool like any other, and JR had spent his entire life learning how to use tools, how to pick them up, turn them over, find their weight and balance, how to use them for purposes their makers had never intended. Cliff thought the law was a shield, something that would protect him if he just held it up high enough. JR knew better. The law was a weapon, and like all weapons, it didn't care who wielded it or why. It only cared about being wielded well. His secretary buzzed in. "Mr. Ewing, your 3 o'clock is here." "Send them in," JR said. He straightened his tie, checked his reflection in the window glass, and smiled. Not the razor blade smile he'd given Cliff. This one was warmer, more welcoming. The smile of a man about to make someone else very happy by giving them exactly what they wanted, in exchange for something they didn't yet realize they couldn't afford to lose. Because that was the real art of it. Not the insults, not the put-downs, not the moments of theatrical cruelty that people would remember and repeat. Those were just decoration. The real art was in understanding that every person who walked through his door wanted something, and that wanting something meant having a weakness, and that having a weakness meant being controllable. Cliff Barnes wanted justice. That made him predictable. Bobby wanted family. Sue Ellen wanted respect. Jock wanted legacy. Everyone wanted something, and JR had built his empire on the simple recognition that a man who knew what others wanted would always have more power than a man who only knew what he wanted himself. The door opened. A banker from Houston stepped in, nervous and eager. JR stood up, extended his hand, and smiled his warmest smile. "Come in. Come in. Can I get you a drink? I was just thinking about you." And it began again. The dance, the negotiation. The slow, careful process of making someone believe they were getting exactly what they needed right up until the moment they realized they'd given away everything that mattered. Later that evening, after the banker had left and the office had emptied, JR sat alone in the gathering darkness. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat, watching the city transform from day to night, the buildings lighting up one by one like stars coming out. His father had once told him that business was war by other means. That had been true as far as it went. But Jock had missed the essential point. War had rules, conventions, limits. Business, real business, the kind that built dynasties and broke families, had none of those things. honest in its way. It was about understanding that everything was negotiable, except the fact that someone had to win and someone had to lose. JR had understood that from the beginning, had understood it so deeply and completely that it had become part of how he breathed. Other men went into business thinking they could get rich and keep their hands clean. That was the real naivety, the real weakness. Money didn't care about clean hands. Power didn't care about moral victories. And success, real success, required being willing to do what others wouldn't, not because it was fun, not because it was right, but because it was necessary. He thought about Cliff, probably home by now, probably pouring himself a drink and telling himself that next time would be different, that next time he'd be smarter, faster, better prepared. The tragedy was that he meant it, that he really believed it, that somewhere in that dogged, determined heart of his, Cliff Barnes genuinely thought that persistence and righteousness would eventually triumph over cunning and ruthlessness. JR almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But pity was a luxury he couldn't afford. The moment you started feeling sorry for your opponents was the moment you started pulling your punches. And the moment you started pulling your punches was the moment someone faster and hungrier came along and took everything you'd built. So he didn't feel sorry for Cliff. He felt grateful. Grateful for the reminder that there were still people in the world who believed in rules and fairness and cosmic justice. People who made the game interesting by actually thinking they could win. Because beating someone who knew they were outmatched from the start wasn't victory, it was just business. But beating someone who genuinely believed they had a chance, that was art. The phone rang. He considered not answering it, considered just sitting here in the darkness, alone with his thoughts and his city and his perfectly constructed empire. But that wasn't who he was. J.R. Ewing didn't ignore opportunities, even if they came at inconvenient times. Ewing, he said, was Judge Pryor. His voice had that careful, controlled quality that meant he was calling from somewhere public. We need to talk about those files. What about them? Barnes isn't going to let this go. You know how he is. Persistent. I'm counting on it, J.R. said. Persistence without strategy is just stupidity with better posture. Let him come. Let him dig. Every hour he spends chasing ghosts is an hour he's not actually threatening me. You're playing a dangerous game, Judge Yar said, and his voice carried all the weight of a man who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. I'm not playing anything. This is my life. This is what I do, and I do it better than anyone else has ever done it. Now those files are going to hold up to scrutiny, aren't they? A pause, and they'll hold. That's what I thought. Have a good evening, Judge. And next time you're worried about Cliff Barnes, remember that I've been dealing with him since we were children. He's never surprised me yet. He hung up before Pryor could respond, because that was another part of the art. Knowing when to listen and when to dismiss, when to negotiate and when to dictate, when to be charming and when to be cold. It was all timing, all feel. All the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent learning that the world didn't give you what you deserved. It gave you what you took. J.R. Ewing stood up. He put on his jacket, straightened his hat, and walked out of his office. The hallway was empty. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Outside, his car was waiting. Beyond that, home. Sue Ellen, Bobby, the family dinner where everyone would smile and pretend they didn't all have secrets, eating them alive from the inside. That was fine. Let them pretend. Let them play their parts. JR knew who he was. He knew what he wanted. And he knew with the absolute certainty that came from never having been proven wrong, that wanting something and being willing to do anything to get it would always be wanting something and hoping the universe would deliver it on merit. Cliff Barnes would try again. That was inevitable. He'd find some new angle, some new approach, some new reason to believe that this time finally justice would prevail. And JR would be waiting. Not because he had to be, but because watching Cliff fail had become part of the rhythm of his life, like the seasons changing, like the sun rising over Dallas every morning, indifferent to the dreams of lesser men. The elevator doors closed. JR caught his reflection in the polished brass. He looked tired, not weak, never weak, but tired in the way that comes from carrying weight for so long that you forget what it feels like to put it down. This was the price. This was what nobody told you when you started climbing. That getting to the top meant staying there forever. Because the moment you relaxed, the moment you decided you'd done enough, someone else would be there to take it all away. He wouldn't relax. He wouldn't stop. He would keep playing the game, keep making the moves, keep being J.R. Ewing until the day he died or the day the world changed so completely that his skills no longer mattered. That day wasn't today. That day wasn't coming anytime soon. So he would go home. He would smile at his family. He would pour himself a bourbon and read the evening paper and think about tomorrow's opportunities. And somewhere across town, Cliff Barnes would be doing the same thing, preparing for the next battle in a war he didn't understand he'd already lost. That was the real art of the insult, not the words themselves, not the clever put-downs or the brutal comebacks, but the understanding that some defeats are permanent, that some people are born to win and some are born to learn, and that knowing which one you are matters more than any amount of preparation or righteousness or law. J.R. Ewing knew which one he was. That knowledge was his power, his burden, and his legacy. Everything else was just details.